They came knocking on my cabin door at sunrise, 3 HOA members holding papers that looked official enough to scare anyone. "You're being removed from community property," they said. I didn't argue. I just smiled and said, "You might want to double-check that map you're holding, because you're standing on my front lawn." I bought this cabin years ago, long before there was a homeowners association, before the new developments, and long before the fancy boats and rules moved in. Back then, this place was just a quiet patch of land beside a small lake, surrounded by pine trees and silence. My grandfather built this cabin himself after returning from service. He called it Stillwater, said the lake reminded him that peace doesn't make noise. When he passed, it became mine. Years later, developers arrived. They built luxury homes around the lake, paved new roads, and formed an HOA Haven Lake community. I wasn't part of it, because my property wasn't inside their zone. My cabin stood on its own deed, on land older than the neighborhood itself. At first, things were fine. Neighbors waved, kids fished from the dock, and everyone enjoyed the water. But the moment the HOA realized my dock and half the lake weren't theirs to regulate, they started sending letters. Unauthorized use of community waterway. Dock not compliant with design standards. And finally, notice of removal, non-compliant resident. That last one came with a deadline. When I called to explain, they told me I was mistaken, that their records showed the cabin was community property. I didn't argue. I simply said, "If you're so sure, then let's find out." 2 days later, I woke up to find bright orange markers staked across my property right through the garden and down to the lake. Apparently, the HOA had surveyed the land themselves. They even posted a new sign, "Private access, HOA members only." I called their office, but the president, Marjorie Fields, refused to speak. She told her assistant to tell me, "He'll have to vacate if he refuses compliance." The arrogance was almost funny. They started acting like landlords, sending inspection notices, even warning my guests not to trespass. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived with an official county seal on it. It was an eviction notice, delivered through the HOA's legal representative. That's when I knew they'd gone too far. Instead of getting angry, I went to the county registrar's office and pulled the original land deed from 1958. It clearly showed the lakebed and surrounding property belonged to Stillwater Holdings, the name my grandfather had used. Guess whose name appeared as successor on that document? Mine. Even better, the community dock, where HOA residents parked their boats and held barbecues, sat squarely inside my property lines. I didn't say a word. I just made copies. Then I called the county land surveyor to verify every inch of it officially. The result? The HOA had built nearly 1/3 of their facilities on my land. So when they scheduled their next HOA board meeting, the one where they planned to finalize my eviction, I decided to attend. The meeting took place in their community hall, which ironically, also stood on my property. I arrived early, taking a seat near the back. The moment I walked in, the chatter quieted. Marjorie, the president, cleared her throat and said, "Mr. Hall, this is a closed session." I smiled. "Oh, I think you'll want me here." The room filled with neighbors, some curious, others hostile. The HOA lawyer began reading, "Due to repeated violations of Haven Lake regulations and non-payment of association dues, Mr. Hall's residence shall be subject to removal and property reassignment." When he finished, Marjorie looked at me with that same satisfied smirk. "Anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" I stood up, calm and steady. "Yes. But it's better if we hear from someone else first." At that cue, the county land surveyor I'd contacted stepped through the door, holding a folder. He greeted everyone politely and said, "I've been asked to confirm boundary lines between Mr. Hall's property and Haven Lake community." He laid out the maps. The hall went silent as the bright red outlines appeared. "The cabin here," he said, pointing, "sits on private land owned by Daniel Hall. The dock, the lake up to its midpoint, and this entire lower lot," he paused and tapped the paper, "also belong to him." You could hear a pin drop. Marjorie blinked. "That's not possible." The surveyor smiled gently. "These are county records. They don't lie." What happened next could have been a movie scene. The HOA lawyer shuffled his papers, stammering about misfiled plats. Marjorie turned pale, realizing the hall we were standing in sat squarely within my property line. I reached into my folder and pulled out a copy of the deed. "This was filed in 1958, I said. "I've just been maintaining what my grandfather left me." "You built your facilities here years later without realizing who the land belonged to." Someone in the crowd whispered, "Wait, does that mean the HOA's dock isn't theirs either?" The surveyor nodded. "It belongs to Mr. Hall." Marjorie tried one last defense, "We've invested community funds maintaining that property." "And I appreciate that," I said. "Consider that payment for use of my land. But going forward, we'll need to make a new agreement, properly documented." The lawyer coughed. "An agreement?" "Yes. A land use contract." The neighbors began murmuring again, but this time, they weren't angry at me. They were angry at the HOA board for their mistake. Marjorie stepped back, defeated. "You can't possibly expect." I interrupted gently, "Expect? No. I don't expect anything. I'm offering you a fair lease. You can keep your dock, your lot, and your access if you start respecting property lines and stop harassing the people who were here before you." That was the moment everything changed. The following week, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, without me this time. By the end of it, Marjorie and 2 members resigned. The remaining board voted unanimously to accept a land lease agreement with me for continued use of the lake and dock area. The county drafted the paperwork, and within a month, the situation was legally resolved. The best part? The lease fees they now pay each year go directly toward maintaining the water quality and shoreline restoration projects I'd been funding myself for years. One neighbor, a retired teacher, came by later with a plate of cookies and said, "Mr. Hall, I think you just taught this whole community a lesson." I laughed. I didn't teach anyone anything. I just read the fine print. Life at the lake is peaceful again. The HOA now focuses on gardening, safety, and holiday lights, not power trips. They even invited me to speak at their annual meeting this year to share community history. I told them about my grandfather, how he believed land wasn't about ownership, but about responsibility. He used to say, "You don't own the water. You just take care of the shore." When I look out over that lake now, I see more than just property lines. I see people learning to coexist, to respect the quiet things that don't need rules to stay beautiful. And every time someone mentions the eviction story, I just smile and pour another cup of coffee. Because deep down, I know that sometimes the calmest person in the room holds the most power, not because they fight the hardest, but because they understand when to let the truth do the talking. They tried to evict me from my own home, thinking they ran this lake. But here's the thing about ownership, it doesn't need permission. It only needs patience. In the end, they learned that real authority isn't about titles or rules, it's about knowing what's truly yours.